The whole country stood still, breathless. A mother, accused of killing her own daughter, was acquitted in front of the public. Casey Anthony. The name has become a symbol of cruelty and indifference. But after 6 weeks of trial, when the final decision was announced, she was found not guilty. Shocking beyond belief. Millions of people followed the case, from the long nights listening to the tense hearings to the small details of a mother's life who, all the time her daughter was missing, was partying and participating in bikini contests. She killed a child, and yet she was set free. Caylee Anthony's death was a tragedy that everyone felt. But in the end, despite the evidence pointing to one thing, Casey Anthony was the culprit. She walked out of court with a smile on her face. So, where's the justice? Justice or failure? Justice or failure? You've heard a lot about this case, but do you really understand what happened in the courtroom? Follow along in part 5 of this documentary series to find the answer to the big question: how could a mother kill her daughter and still be acquitted? On July 15, 2008, Cindy Anthony called the police to report the disappearance of her niece, 2-year-old Caylee Anthony. Caylee's mother, Casey Anthony, did not call the police, even though a month had passed without any trace of Caylee. For Cindy, everything was too confusing and unusual. Casey continued to live her life, going out, attending parties, showing no signs of worry or looking for her daughter. It was only when Cindy called the police that things became serious. Casey claimed that Caylee was staying with a nanny named Zani the nanny, whom she described as a close, trusted friend. But when the police began investigating, they found no trace of Zani, and none of Casey's family or friends had any information about him. The next day, Casey claimed that Caylee was staying with another friend, but still had no information about him. The police began to doubt Casey's story, and her stories only seemed to get more and more confusing. Casey changed her story every time she was pressed about Zani and Caylee's possible whereabouts, and her stories became increasingly inconsistent. She continued to insist that Caylee was being cared for by someone named Zani and had never reported her missing, even though she could not provide a clear address for him. As the police continued to investigate, they were unable to find any trace of Zani. Casey changed her story and said that Caylee had been kidnapped by a woman named Zani, who Casey believed had been taking care of her daughter. Casey could not answer questions clearly, and each time she was asked, the story became more confusing. She changed her story again, saying that Caylee was staying with an old friend of hers. The police began to suspect that everything Casey said was a lie. Caylee was not staying with anyone. Zani did not exist. The police could not find anyone named Zani, and they began to understand that Casey was hiding something. On July 17th, the police continued their investigation and found Casey's black Pontiac Sunfire in the parking lot. A strong stench emanating from the car made the police feel that something was wrong. When they opened the car, they realized it was the smell of death, the smell of a decomposing body. The garbage bags in the car not only contained rotting food, but also blood and other foreign substances. Upon closer inspection, they discovered chloroform, a substance that can cause unconsciousness. And things became even clearer when Casey's car became one of the key clues in the case. Police could not help but suspect the relationship between Caylee and Casey's car. Caylee's body had not been found, but one thing was clear: Casey's car contained some undeniable clues. Investigators suspected that Caylee had been sedated and died in the car, and that Casey had hidden her daughter's body. They began to look for more evidence, hoping to shed light on the story Casey was telling. On December 11th, Caylee's body was finally found in an area near the Anthony family home, lying in a garbage bag thrown on the side of the road, wrapped in a blanket. Forensic doctors confirmed that Caylee had been dead for at least a week before her body was discovered. Casey did not report Caylee to the police when she went missing, which led to further suspicions from the police and the public about her indifference and cruelty. When Caylee's body was brought to the medical examiner's office, forensic experts were unable to immediately determine the cause of death due to the advanced decomposition of the body. However, the discovery of chloroform in the car and traces of tape around Caylee's mouth and nose indicated a deliberate act. Caylee did not die by accident, but by deliberate action. of a murderer. The next day, when the news of Kaylee's death was announced, public opinion could not stop. People could not accept this truth. Casey was not only an irresponsible mother, but she was also a murderer. Questions were raised. Why did she do this? Why did she not report her daughter's disappearance to the police? These details made public opinion even more indignant. Images of Casey having fun at parties, participating in bikini competitions, while Kaylee was missing aroused indescribable hatred. Casey was the girl's mother, but there was no sign of grief or worry. She lived a free life while Kaylee was missing. These details were exposed and became one of the biggest media events of that year. Casey kept changing her testimony, each time more contradictory and confusing. From Kaylee being with Zani to her kidnapping, it was all lies. The lack of transparency in Casey's testimony only added to the suspicions about her. And the more we looked, the more bizarre details were discovered about Casey's life. The entire nation followed the case, and when Kaylee was finally found, it was impossible to understand how a mother could do such a terrible thing to her own daughter. The stories of Zani the nanny, the constantly changing statements, and the irrefutable forensic evidence made Casey Anthony. As soon as Kaylee Anthony went missing, the police began gathering every piece of information they could to find out the truth. However, the inconsistencies in Casey Anthony's testimony from the beginning made investigators feel that something was wrong. Not only did Casey change her story about Kaylee's whereabouts, but she also couldn't provide any evidence to back up her claims. The police quickly realized that they were dealing with a liar who they needed to get to know more about in order to solve the case. Initially, Casey claimed that Kaylee was staying with a nanny named Zani the nanny, someone she described as a very close and trusted friend. However, when the police began investigating, they couldn't find any trace of Zani. Investigators couldn't verify any information about this person. Zani didn't appear in any of Casey's files, and no one in Casey's family or friends knew about this person. Every detail she provided was unfounded and unverifiable. This made investigators suspicious of Casey. They thought she might have made up this nanny to explain Kaylee's disappearance. And as they continued to dig into Casey's story, they realized that not only was Kaylee not with Zani, but she couldn't pinpoint any other places Kaylee could be. Casey continued to change her story about where Kaylee might be, and each time she spoke, the story became more vague and unbelievable. On July 16, 2008, Casey continued to claim that she had left Kaylee with an old friend, but when police investigated this friend, they couldn't find any information. Casey again claimed that Kaylee had been kidnapped by a woman named Zani, who Casey believed had been taking care of her daughter. But when the police asked Casey for more information about Zani, she couldn't come up with any. The more she talked, the more confused she became. This made investigators suspect that Casey wasn't just a worried mother, but that she was deliberately hiding the truth. On July 17th, the police began investigating Casey's Pontiac Sunfire. When they opened the car door, a strong stench immediately hit them. The smell was distinctive, the smell of death, a very specific smell of a decomposing body. Upon closer inspection, the police discovered that Casey's car was filled with trash bags, food scraps, and strange traces. Most surprising was the discovery of chloroform in Casey's car. Chloroform is a substance that can render a person unconscious and can even cause death if used improperly. This couldn't be explained by any rational reason. The police immediately realized that Kaylee may have been intoxicated before her death. Chloroform is not something that a normal person can easily obtain, and its presence in Casey's car indicated that she had deliberately prepared Kaylee's death. This was not just a coincidence or an accident. Not only that, the police also discovered a blanket in Casey's trunk that had traces of blood on it. This blanket was believed to have been used to wrap Kaylee before her body was thrown into the trash bag. Casey continued to claim that she knew nothing about Kaylee's death, but this evidence made it clear that Casey Anthony was the sole perpetrator in this case. When this evidence was widely released, Casey continued to maintain a cold attitude and showed no signs of remorse. She showed no concern about her daughter's death. She continued to answer the police's questions without any emotion. Investigators could not understand how Casey could be so calm when she knew that she was the one who killed her daughter. The public began to realize that Casey's story was not only inconsistent, but also the lack of evidence to prove her innocence. The details about the car, about the chloroform, and about the blanket that wrapped Kaylee's body became irrefutable evidence. Casey Anthony was no longer a simple mother, but a ruthless killer. However, the truth was still not completely clear. The public still could not understand why Casey killed her daughter. Why would a mother do such a thing? Was she too selfish and wanted freedom? Or was Kaylee a burden that Casey could not bear? These questions remained unanswered, and with each passing day, Casey became more emotionless and cold. As the police continued to investigate, they not only uncovered more important evidence, but also discovered that Casey had a history of persistent lying. She had changed her story multiple times, and each time she changed it, it became more complicated and unbelievable. Not only did Casey lie about Zani, but she lied about everything, from not knowing where Kaylee was to not remembering that she hid her daughter's body in the car. These lies not only made the police more suspicious, but also increased public outrage. The public began to feel hatred and pity for Kaylee. An innocent child was killed by her own mother. Those who loved her felt betrayed by the person who brought her into the world. Casey was not only Kaylee's mother, but also the perpetrator of her child's death. However, Casey still firmly maintained her testimony, and all the clear evidence from the moment Casey Anthony entered the courtroom, the public could not take their eyes off her. Casey showed no emotion as she stood before the jury, and her cold demeanor only increased the public's hatred of her. Everyone waited to see if justice would be served, or if Casey would continue to hide the truth behind lies. Prosecutor Jeff Ashton began the trial by presenting clear evidence of Kaylee's death. He showed pictures of Casey's Pontiac Sunfire, which contained the smell of death and traces of chloroform. The prosecutor asserted that there was no reasonable explanation for what happened, and all the evidence pointed to one thing. Casey Anthony was the culprit who killed her daughter. The evidence of chloroform in Casey's car was a key point in the trial. Chloroform is an anesthetic, and its presence in Casey's car led investigators to suspect that Kaylee may have been anesthetized before she was killed. Forensic doctors also discovered traces of duct tape around Kaylee's mouth and nose, indicating that she had been suffocated before she died. Not only was Kaylee brutally murdered, but her death also had a clear sign of intentionality. However, Jose Baez, Casey's defense attorney, disagreed with the prosecutor's argument. Baez immediately countered by presenting a completely opposite strategy. Not only did he deny the entire accusation, but he also proposed a surprising theory. Kaylee may have died as a result of an accident in her grandparents' pool. He asserted that Casey had no intention of killing her daughter, but was simply a frightened mother who did not know what to do when faced with her death. Baez asked the jury not to jump to conclusions, but to consider all possibilities before making a decision. Throughout the trial, Baez repeatedly criticized the prosecutor for jumping to conclusions about the crime without solid evidence. He continued to point out that Casey was not a murderer, but a grieving mother who was psychologically stressed and did not know what to do in that difficult situation. Baez tried to convince the jury that Kaylee was not the victim of a deliberate act, but a terrible accident that Casey had no control over. However, Prosecutor Ashton repeatedly exposed the contradictions in Casey's testimony. He pointed out that Casey's story did not match the evidence. When Casey said that Kaylee was kidnapped by Zani the nanny, there was no evidence to prove Zani's existence. Searches for her were unsuccessful. Even when Casey claimed that Kaylee had been abducted by a stranger, the police could not find any trace of her abduction. One of the strengths of the prosecution's case was the constant change in Casey's testimony. Each time she was questioned, the story changed from saying that Kaylee was with Zani to that she was with an old friend to a story about a kidnapping. Prosecutor Ashton pointed out that this was not the action of a grieving mother, but the action of someone trying to hide the truth. A notable point in the trial was the reaction of George Anthony, Casey's father. When he took the stand, he was strongly criticized by Baez, who suggested that George may have abused Casey in the past, which caused her psychological harm. George immediately denied these allegations, asserting that he had no knowledge of Kaylee's death. He could not imagine Casey killing Kaylee, and even more so, why she would hide her daughter's body. The tension in the courtroom grew as the parties continued to argue over the details of the case. Cindy Anthony, Casey's mother, also testified and asserted that she had no knowledge of Kaylee's death. Cindy appeared distressed and could not understand her daughter's actions. However, all the testimony from the Anthony family could not change the conclusion of the investigators. Casey killed Kaylee. The trial continued to be tense, with confrontations between the prosecutor and the defense attorney. Each side had their own arguments, but it was clear that Casey Anthony could not escape the undeniable legal evidence. Everything seemed so clear, but the only thing the public wanted to know now was whether Casey would be convicted or not. On July 5, 2011, Casey sat quietly in the courtroom as the judge read the verdict. The courtroom was silent, and when the judge declared Casey Anthony innocent, a wave of anger rose from the public. Those who demanded justice for Kaylee could not accept this. Casey Anthony, the man accused of killing his daughter, was found not guilty. She was found not guilty, even though all the evidence pointed to her guilt. Kaylee Anthony, the innocent girl, could not get justice. But why would a mother do this? And why did Casey get away with her crime? The Casey Anthony trial began on May 24, 2011, in Orange County District Court, and it quickly became one of the most widely watched cases in American history. Not only because of the gravity of the case, but also because of the continuing public outrage against Casey. The entire country followed every detail of the trial, and all eyes were on Casey Anthony, the mother the public could not forgive. Jeff Ashton, the lead prosecutor, was the first to open the trial with powerful words. "This is not a case about an accident. This is a case about a mother killing her own daughter," he asserted. He went on to explain to the jury about Kaylee Anthony, the innocent child who had tragically lost her life, and what he said was Casey's intentional actions. Ashton's every word was backed up by undeniable evidence. The smell of death in Casey's car, traces of chloroform, and the presence of duct tape around Kaylee's mouth and nose. These details were not random. They were signs of a deliberate act, a premeditated act. Casey Anthony killed her daughter to free herself from her responsibilities as a mother, Ashton said. He went on to point out that, in the weeks after Kaylee's disappearance, Casey showed no signs of concern, did not call the police, did not look for her daughter. Instead, she continued to party, go to bars, even compete in bikini competitions. She lived a free life, not worrying about her daughter, while her 2-year-old was dead. The courtroom fell silent, and everyone watched Casey. Casey Anthony did not react. She sat there, her hands clasped together, her eyes staring coldly ahead. There was no emotion on her face, no tears, no sign of guilt for her daughter's death. This only added to the hatred she felt for her in the public's hearts. When Jose Baez, Casey's defense attorney, began his defense, he couldn't help but make an extremely bold argument that was completely at odds with Ashton's. Baez asserted that Kaylee was not the victim of premeditated murder. Instead, Kaylee may have died from an accident. Baez theorized that Kaylee may have drowned in her grandparents' pool, and Casey panicked, not knowing what to do, and so she hid her daughter's body. Baez continued to emphasize that Casey was not the murderer the prosecutor was claiming, but a traumatized mother who had faced too many hardships in her life and could not process the death of her child. She couldn't accept this loss. She didn't know what to do. Kaylee didn't die in a deliberate act. It was an accident that Casey had no control over, Baez said. The courtroom grew increasingly tense as Baez continued to build his case, criticizing the prosecutor for turning the case into a moral battle rather than focusing solely on the facts. Baez not only wanted to prove that Casey did not kill Kaylee, but he also tried to portray Casey as a victim of domestic abuse, particularly from her father, George Anthony. He argued that the trauma Casey suffered as a child had affected her ability to be a mother, and that this partly explained her actions. Throughout the trial, evidence continued to be presented. Casey changed her story several times, each time becoming more and more unbelievable. She claimed that Kaylee had been kidnapped, but when the police could not find anyone who could support that story, she changed her story and said that Kaylee had died in an accident. Interviews with Casey's friends also revealed that she frequently attended parties, not caring about Kaylee's disappearance. Photos of Casey at parties became a powerful piece of evidence in the case, as people could not understand how she could be so happy while her daughter was missing. The evidence of chloroform in Casey's car only added to the suspicions about her actions. Chloroform is an anesthetic, and the discovery of it in Casey's car suggests that Kaylee may have been drugged before her death. Traces of duct tape around Kaylee's mouth and nose also suggest that she was suffocated. Prosecutor Ashton has repeatedly stressed that all of these clues prove that Kaylee's death was not an accident, but a deliberate act. In addition, Baez has repeatedly criticized the prosecutors for the way they handled the case. He asserted that investigators rushed to conclusions about Casey and that they tried to impose theories without concrete evidence. He argued the jury argued that Kaylee could have died from an unforeseen accident, and that Casey's hiding of the body was simply the panicked reaction of a mother who didn't know what to do in a difficult situation. However, every word Baez said was strongly refuted by Ashton. Ashton continued to clarify each piece of evidence, pointing out that Casey could not have been unaware that her daughter was dead, that she could not have concealed Kaylee's death without a reasonable excuse. He asked the jury to look at the evidence objectively and make a decision based on facts, not emotions. The trial continued to be tense, with legal strategies constantly clashing between prosecutors and defense attorneys. Casey sat silently, expressionless, her eyes never leaving the desk. She showed no remorse, no emotion about her daughter's death. Despite the overwhelming evidence of Kaylee's death, Casey remained calm, as if the whole thing had nothing to do with her. Both the public and those in the courtroom expected a quick decision, but while the evidence was strong, the jury's decision was far from certain. July 5, 2011, a day that the entire United States and indeed the world will never forget. After weeks of tense trial, with dramatic confrontations between prosecutor Jeff Ashton and defense attorney Jose Baez, all eyes were on the courtroom, awaiting the final decision from the jury. Casey Anthony, the mother accused of killing her daughter, Kaylee, was faced with irrefutable evidence. Kaylee was killed in her mother's car, with clear traces of chloroform and duct tape around her mouth and nose. But despite this, Casey never once showed remorse, never once apologized. Throughout the trial, she remained cold, not a tear shed, not a word of remorse. Photos of her attending parties, dancing, and laughing while Kaylee was missing only fueled public outrage. When a verdict was read, Casey Anthony pleaded not guilty to first-degree murder, manslaughter, or child abuse. She was found not guilty of all charges related to Kaylee's death. The courtroom was silent for a moment. Everyone in the courtroom, from Kaylee's family to the watching public, could not believe what they had just witnessed. People still had images of the young girl partying, now walking free. The name Casey Anthony became a symbol, not of justice, but of the failure of the legal system. The whole country could not understand how she could get away with murder when all the evidence pointed to her. Kaylee, the innocent girl, had died a cruel death, and her mother was free to go out and live her life as if nothing had happened. After the verdict was announced, Nancy Grace, a popular HLN host, could not keep her composure. On a live show, she relentlessly criticized the verdict, asserting that Casey Anthony was the murderer and that she should be held accountable. "This is a travesty of justice," she said in outrage. Those demanding justice for Kaylee could not accept this decision. They organized protests and continued to fight for justice for the girl. Casey walked out of the courtroom and did not return once. She showed no sign of grief over her daughter's death. Meanwhile, Casey's family, who had suffered for the past 3 years, could not find words to say. George Anthony, the father, stood silently in the courtroom, his eyes red, unable to accept this verdict. He and Cindy had lost Kaylee, and now they had to face Casey's release. Some people still feel that Casey is truly innocent, but justice in this case cannot satisfy anyone. Questions remain, and one big question remains in everyone's heart. Why would a mother kill her own daughter? Casey Anthony escaped conviction, but she still has to live with the constant criticism of the public. She cannot escape the shadow of Kaylee, and even if she continues to live her life, she will always be haunted by her daughter's death. Although Casey Anthony was acquitted of murder, Kaylee still cannot get justice. The failure of the legal system in this case has made the public lose faith in justice. But in the world full of unsolved crimes, another case has the whole of America watching: the Golden State Killer. The Golden State Killer, whose real name is Joseph James DeAngelo, was responsible for a series of murders and sexual assaults throughout the 1970s and 1980s in California. However, it wasn't until 2018, when DNA technology and advanced forensic methods were applied, that the killer was arrested. This is a story not to be missed. Golden State Killer: First Attacks in California True Crime Documentary, Part 1, will take you into the first attacks of this criminal and shed light on his brutality. Will justice be served for his victims? Don't miss Part 1 of the Golden State Killer documentary series, where we will delve into the first attacks and the dramatic investigation that brought Joseph James DeAngelo to light and brought justice to his deceased victims.